This evening we're continuing in our series, and tonight it's Denied by a Friend, and we're looking at Luke chapter 22, verses 54 to 62. So that's Luke chapter 22, verses 54 to 62. I'll read the passage through first of all, and then we'll look at it in a little bit more depth afterwards. So it's denied by a friend. Then seizing him, they led him away and took him into the house of the high priest. Peter followed at a distance. But when they had kindled a fire in the middle of the courtyard and sat down together, Peter sat down with them. A servant girl saw him seated there in the firelight. She looked closely at him and said, "This man was with him." But he denied it. "Woman, I don't know him," he said. A little later, someone else saw him and said, "You also are one of them." "Man, I am not," Peter replied. And about an hour later, another asserted, "Certainly this fellow was with him, for he is a Galilean." Peter replied, "Man, I don't know what you're talking about." And just as he was speaking, the cock crowed. The Lord turned and looked straight at Peter. Then Peter remembered the words the Lord had spoken to him. "Before the cock crows today, you will disown me 3 times. And he went outside and wept bitterly. So our passage starts by sort of telling us that then they seized him and led us, Jesus of course, and led him away into the house of the high priest, and that Peter followed at a distance. Jesus had just been arrested by the temple troops in the Garden of Gethsemane. And Peter, who had just cut off the ear of the high priest's representative in a violent attempt to try and resist Jesus' arrest. And in Mark chapter 14, verses 50 and 52, we're given a little bit more information in that we read here how the disciples had fled for their lives as troops trying to seize a young man with Jesus' group. This young man escaped naked into the night, his garment left in the hands of his captor. So it was a terrible, terrifying and bewildering night for Jesus' disciples. And they scattered. We're not told exactly where they went, but they scattered. But it seems that Peter must have stayed hidden in the darkness, and so that he could sort of see what was happening to Jesus. And then, as they led him away, he followed them at a safe distance. Now, Peter and Andrew, of course, were the first 2 disciples that were told Jesus called. And he had been a follower of Jesus for 3 years. And, here, Peter's continuing to be a follower of Jesus. But now, he is following at a distance as Jesus is marched away to the high priest's house. So Peter, he's been a follower of Jesus for 3 years, and he has no intentions of stopping now. But it's not so closely, obviously, as he has. And but then we're told that in verse 55, "But when they had kindled a fire in the middle of the courtyard, and had sat down together, Peter sat down with them." And again in another of the Gospels, John this time, John 18, verses 15 and 16. So it gives us a little bit more information in that it says that Simon Peter and another disciple were following Jesus. And because this disciple, that's obviously not Peter, the other disciple, was known to the high priest, he went with Jesus into the high priest's courtyard. But Peter had to wait outside at the door. And the other disciple, who was known to the high priest, came back, spoke to the girl on duty there, and brought Peter in. So it would seem that this courtyard was open to the sky, but it was surrounded by buildings and a wall. And there was obviously just one gateway which was guarded, which led into this courtyard. So it wasn't just a case of Peter being able to walk straight into the courtyard. And it's said that when they had kindled the fire, that Peter sat down with them, and the pronouns they and them in verse 55 probably refer to the temple soldiers who had just arrested Jesus. And presumably the elders and the chief priests officers had gone inside where they were interrogating Jesus. And so obviously, Peter must have known that by entering this courtyard that he was putting himself in danger. Jesus had just been arrested, and so yes, he must have known. And it's a cold and it's a dark night. One would imagine that maybe there was a sort of light shining out into the courtyard, perhaps from a window or from the room, perhaps where Jesus was being interrogated. We don't really know. But a fire had been lit, and people were crowded around the fire to keep warm. And if he had stood back away from those who were around the fire, he would have looked very conspicuous. And so one imagines that that's perhaps one of the reasons. He may have been cold as well, but I think that's probably the main reason that he joined them around the fire. Sometimes the best place to hide is in a crowd, and I think probably in this case this is what Peter does. So now he finds himself sitting around the fire with the very men who were sent out to arrest Jesus. And he must surely have wondered what would happen to him if they realised who he was. And maybe too, we don't know, it just doesn't so tell, but I would imagine that he was trying to hear what is happening to Jesus. He's just trying to find out what's happening. And maybe he was able to hear something, but for now, I would imagine that he was just felt that he was as close as he could get to Jesus at this point. And he'd probably been sitting there for quite some time, trying to keep a low profile. And you can imagine his courage was being tested to the limit at this point. And then we read in verses 56 and 57 that a servant girl saw him seated there in the firelight. She looked closely at him and said, "This man was with him." But Peter denied it. "Woman, I don't know him," he said. Yeah, so here we have Peter's first denial. And it's not one of the temple soldiers who recognized him and challenged him. But instead it's a servant girl who is the first to recognize Peter. But sadly, instead of telling the truth and putting himself in even more danger, he replies with a terrible lie. And he's obviously hoping that that will be an end to it. And after all, no one else recognised him, so, perhaps who's going to sort of take much notice of this young girl, particularly a young servant girl. But of course, it was not the end of it as he had hoped. And we're not told exactly how long, but in verse 58 we read that a little later someone else saw him and said, "You also are one of them." And again he says, "Man, I am not." So repeating Peter's reply. And so we have Peter's second denial. And having lied once, it now leads to a further terrible lie. And doesn't end there. As we're told then, about an hour later, another asserted, "Certainly this fellow was with him, for he is a Galilean." And in some of the other versions, it sort of does tell us that someone even recognised him as being the one who had used the sword to cut off the ear of the priest's representative. We don't know, it doesn't say that in this, but regardless, Peter is challenged quite clearly. And for the third time, Peter replies, "Man, I don't know what you're talking about." And just as he was speaking, the cock crowed. In Mark's Gospel, we're given additional information because when this third challenge is made, Mark 14, verse 71 states that he began to call down curses on himself, and swore to them, "I don't know this man you were talking about." It's the fact that when someone tells one lie, they then end up telling even greater lies in order to cover up the initial lie. And sadly, this was so with Peter. And what a terrible act Peter's initial lie has led him into now. He has sworn using an oath that he doesn't know Jesus. And just as he does so, the cock crowed. And then in verse 61 we read, "The Lord turned and looked straight at Peter. Then Peter remembered the words the Lord had spoken to him. 'Before the cock crows today, you will disown me 3 times.'" So it seems that at that very, very moment, the third denial, the Lord turned and looked straight at Peter. Now, up until this point, there's no indication that Peter can see Jesus, but right at this moment, it's very, very clear that Jesus can see Peter. And we don't know, maybe it's that at that moment Jesus was led out into the courtyard, or perhaps even he was visible through a window. We're not told. We can only surmise, and because it's not very clear. But what is clear is that Peter also saw Jesus look straight at him immediately after the cock crowed. And then Peter remembered the words that Jesus had spoken to him. "Before the cock crows today, you will disown me 3 times. And he went outside and wept bitterly. We can only try to begin to imagine the depths of Peter's pain and remorse. And when it says that he went outside and wept bitterly, I think it was indeed very, very bitterly. I think at this point, probably Peter was a totally broken man. And I guess at first sight, it would be very easy to be critical and to judge Peter. After all, his 3 denials were the one were one of the worst sins of all. He'd denied Jesus. He'd even said that he just didn't know him. But it's not for us to judge him, of course, but instead to learn from this passage and ask ourselves the question: what would I have done? And I have to confess, I think I would have been with the rest of the disciples. I would have been gone. But it's a challenging thought. But Simon Peter and his brother Andrew, as I said, were the first disciples to be called by Jesus, and it was Jesus who also named him Peter, from Simon to Peter, or Simon Peter is often known. He'd been with Jesus for 3 years, during which time he'd been taught many things as he watched Jesus teach. He watched him performing many miracles, watched him healing the sick. And Peter had also had the privilege of witnessing the Transfiguration. And it was Peter who recognized and acknowledged Jesus as the Christ, the Messiah, the Son of the living God. But now, on this terrible dark night, when Jesus has been arrested, his mind is whirling, and he's totally bewildered and confused. For several times, Jesus had explained to the disciples that he must go to Jerusalem and suffer many things at the hands of the elders, the chief priests, and the teachers of the law, and that he must be killed on the third day, and on the third day be raised to life. Let's just with me. Yeah, in Matthew chapter 16, verses 21 to 23, we read that from that time on, Jesus began to explain to his disciples that he must go to Jerusalem and suffer many things at the hands of the elders, the chief priests, and the teachers of the law, and that he must be killed and on the third day be raised to life. And here we read that Peter took him aside and began to rebuke him. "Never, Lord," he said, "this shall never happen to you." Jesus turned and said to Peter, "Get behind me, Satan. You are a stumbling block to me. You do not have in mind the concerns of God, but merely human concerns." And, here is a sort of problem that the disciples had, not just Peter, I think, but in this instance it's obviously clear that Jesus reminds him that he doesn't have in mind the concerns of God, but merely human concerns. And as Brian sort of shared with us at the beginning of this series, and he did it so clearly, the disciples, being Jews, understood the Messiah would come to set them free. But to them, at this time, they just sort of couldn't get their head around what Jesus was trying to sort of tell them. And they couldn't cast off the popular belief at that time that the Messiah would be a political deliverer from the Roman Empire. And I think, this is the problem that Peter has. This is how Peter probably saw things at this time. He couldn't accept that the Lord would be crucified. Just didn't seem to fit in. After all, the disciples had recently witnessed the triumphal entry, and it all seemed to make sense to them at this point, probably. But now Jesus has been arrested, and Peter, who was one of only 2 disciples who had a small sword, has bravely tried to defend Jesus. But Jesus has told him no more violence. And with that, he healed the injured man. And at this point, they're lost. Everyone, all the disciples at this point, everyone deserted Jesus and fled in fear of their lives, except for Peter. I mean, yes, he did flee, but he didn't flee very far, and he did courageously follow and enter that courtyard. But sadly, when challenged, his courage has failed him. And he's denied Jesus just as Jesus said he would. And we can read of that and I've taken that sort of Mark 14, verses 27 to 31, where we read that Jesus tells them, all the disciples, that you will all fall away. Jesus told them, for it is written, I will strike the shepherd and the sheep will be scattered. But after I have risen, I will go ahead of you into Galilee. Peter declared that even if all fall away, I will not. Truly I tell you, Jesus answered, today, yes, tonight, before the rooster crows twice, you yourself will disown me 3 times. But Peter insisted emphatically, even if I have to die with you, I will never disown you. And all the others said the same. Jesus is all-knowing. Yeah, Peter had spoken boldly, but he has failed when put to the test, just as Jesus had said he would. But in the process, he has committed a major sin, a really major sin 3 times. And Peter went outside and wept bitterly. I mean, he's probably wondering how will he ever be able to forgive himself, and he's obviously wondering, what does Jesus think of him now? I'm sure that was very, very important to him. He has failed Jesus so terribly. And so we don't know what happened. Obviously, I would imagine he went away somewhere very, very quiet and alone. But that very day, Jesus is cruelly crucified and his body laid in a tomb. But then, of course, we know that it didn't end there, and we have on the 3rd day the resurrection, a wonderful event. And we also know that when the 2 Marys went to the tomb and then they went back to tell the other disciples that it was Peter and John who ran to the tomb to find that empty tomb. And I mean, of course, Jesus wasn't there. They didn't see him. Mary had the privilege of seeing Jesus in the garden, but they didn't. But Jesus did appear to the disciples, to various disciples on different occasions, and we read in John 21, and now we'll be sort of going through, if you like, you can sort of turn to John 21, verses 14 through to 19. But in John 21, verse 14, we read that this was now the 3rd time that Jesus appeared to his disciples after he was raised from the dead. And then we read that Jesus reinstates Peter. When they had finished eating, Jesus said to Simon Peter, Simon, son of John, do you love me more than these? Yes, Lord, he replied, you know that I love you. Jesus said, feed my lambs. Again Jesus said, Simon, son of John, do you love me? He answered, yes, Lord, you know that I love you. Jesus said, take care of my sheep. The 3rd time he said to them, Simon, son of John, do you love me? Peter was hurt because Jesus asked him the 3rd time, do you love me? He said, Lord, you know all things. You know that I love you. Jesus said, feed my sheep. Very truly I tell you, when you were younger, you dressed yourself and went where you wanted. But when you are old, you will stretch out your hands, and someone else will dress you and lead you to where you do not want to go. Jesus said this to indicate the kind of death by which Peter would glorify God. Then Jesus said, "Follow me." And I think it's so lovely that Jesus so says to him again as he, the word, they say here, Jesus reinstates Peter, that was the title, but it's far, far more than reinstating. You know, he has been redeemed, he has been restored, he's been forgiven. And then Jesus says, "Follow me," and surely, you know, the first time that they met, that was Jesus' request that he should follow him. And Peter did. And yes, he's been fully restored, he's been fully forgiven. He was a broken man, I'm sure, but he has been restored to know the grace, the forgiving love of Jesus. And of course, from that point on, he was a changed man, a different man. And, well, yes, it's another story. But, yes, it is so good, and I mean, that it's a wonderful example of restoration and being redeemed, forgiven. Something we all know we need. And, we all do follow Jesus at different times, even though we don't intend to. We may be striving with our best of intentions to do the right things, and yet so often we fail. But Lord, how wonderful it is that we can know that forgiveness, that we can come to the table, so say we're sorry, and know that we have complete forgiveness. Thank you, Lord. Okay, let's close.